Right, so we're back. January 2018. So let's take a look at questions 1 to 3. And here we start with a table that lists organisms found on a tree. That this data came from a study done by ecology students. And we have here our list of organisms on the left and numbers on the right. Now, looking at this table, if we were to draw a graph, it means that this would be on the x-axis and this would be on the y-axis. Also, a graph that would come from a table like this would usually be a bar graph, because there are these distinct data points, and there isn't really a trend being shown here or change in anything with respect to some other variable going on here. So therefore, if we were to draw a graph, it would be a bar graph. As we can see, there are lots of ants. We can see lots of ants, lots of caterpillars. The larger organisms are a little smaller numbers. And we have one plant. Everybody else are animals. So let's take a look at the question. So we're being asked to plot the data. So when we see plot the data, we can infer it means to draw a graph. And this is our graph. Let's zoom out a little bit so we can see the entire thing. Right, this is your graph. Those of you that looked at my ecology video, this should be familiar, right? It was a January 2018 question. And as we can see, we have it very neatly drawn out. We have our title on top, showing results of a tree study. We have our animals listed on the x-axis. We have the axis labeled. The axis is also labeled here. Notice I put the label for the axis at the top, just above all the numbers. And this is useful if you don't have a lot of space on the side. You can just write the title on top at the end of the line, yeah? And yeah, that's your graph. And we have it's a bar chart, of course. And we have our suggested mark scheme. It's worth 5 marks. So this is how the 5 marks would be distributed. Notice correct formatting includes the titles and the axes and the fact that the axes are labeled, plus a title above the graph, plus the graph taking up about 75% of the grid provided. So if you miss any one of those, you lose the mark, eh? So if you have the title, but the title is wrong or the graph is too small, you lose the entire mark, okay? The rest of it, appropriate scale, right? Appropriate scale on the y-axis, accurate plotting. Notice that the bars are not drawn in ascending or descending order. They are added in the order that they were in the table. All right, so that is something that you should make sure to do. Don't go trying to rearrange the data so that you can get this nice descending or ascending set of bars, because one, that goes against the whole idea of presenting the data as is, and two, it increases the possibility of you making errors. So again, just present the bars as they're already listed in the table. Then we have, right, bar chart, yeah, 1 mark if it's a bar chart. Bars are separate, graph has an appropriate title. Please note that for some of these questions, I have seen where if the question asks you to just draw a graph, and it leaves it up to you to decide what type of graph to draw. There have been cases where if you use the wrong type of graph, the entire question is forfeit. And then there are situations where it's one of the marks provided, and you can still get a few marks here and there. But you don't know what will happen in your case, so make sure to select the correct type of graph if you are asked to draw one, right? Name and outline 2 possible sampling methods used to collect the data. And remember, we were collecting it from a tree, right? It was a tree study. So because it's a sampling method, and as well, it's a tree, that is one tree that you are sampling from, a transect or a quadrat wouldn't really work here, right? So in this case, we would use equipment like a beating tray or a net. And in each of those cases, you also need to outline how it will be used to sample from the habitat, which in this case is the tree, right? So that's how the marks are distributed. We have our beating tray, we have our net, and you have a description of how you'd use the tray and how you'd use the net, right? Then for the next part, we place the organisms from the table into the taxonomic groups, whatever taxonomic group they belong to. So as we can see for arthropod, it could be ant, spider, or caterpillar. Caterpillar because this is the juvenile stage. Of an arthropod. So it can still be classified as an arthropod, yeah. Reptile would be lizard, bird, egret, amphibian, tree frog, right? Straightforward, 1 mark each, good to go. How the method of nutrition used by the wild pine, how it differs from that of other organisms. Well, remember we already observed that the wild pine was the only plant in the list of organisms. So therefore, we can already make the distinction of the plant carrying out photosynthesis, which is autotrophic nutrition, versus the other animals carrying out heterotrophic nutrition, which involves consuming other organisms. And that's what we state here. Now notice I didn't just name it. I didn't just say, well, it's a plant, so therefore it does photosynthesis. Because remember how the question is worded. It is asking you to explain how the method of nutrition used differs. So by just stating it's photosynthesis, or let's say I state it's autotrophic nutrition, wouldn't really tell me how it differs from the other type of nutrition. So this is where you have to describe what we mean by autotrophic versus heterotrophic, right? Photosynthesis versus heterotrophic. And this is what we're doing here, right? The wild pine is a plant. And what does it do? It manufactures its own food using light energy. Whereas the other organisms, they depend on consumption of other organisms and their products. We could even mention that all the other organisms are animals and thus are consumers. And of course, being consumers, they consume other organisms and their products for their nutrition. And that's it. Now you can name it, but it wouldn't really take away or add anything to your overall mark. And then we have to describe the relationship between wild pine and the tree. So we indicate the wild pine is an epiphyte. And that type of plant has a symbiotic relationship. And it says the type of symbiotic relationship is called commensalism. That's where one partner in the relationship benefits and the other partner in the relationship neither benefits or is harmed, right? So there's a neutral impact, no real impact, right? And that's what we outline here. We indicate which one is benefiting, which one is providing benefits, and which one isn't really providing anything or taking away anything. So the tree provides the habitat, it provides organic material, right? It provides a space for all the leaves and detritus to collect so that the wild pine could live in that space, right? And the wild pine basically just says, thank you very much, and just goes about its life doing its thing without really harming the tree, but not really benefiting the tree either. And that's that part of the question. And the next part, they ask us, well, they're providing another situation. There's another type of organism that's observed. It's an orange-yellow vine, and it's growing on one part of the tree. And that part of the tree, the leaves are dying. So now we're seeing a negative impact, yeah? So that's the first thing we mentioned, because they're asking us now, how does the relationship differ? So we have to compare, right? So we say, well, unlike the epiphyte in part E.1, the vine is appearing to cause harm to the tree, right? Remember, again, we can't talk too much in absolutes. We talk in terms of what we observe. So based on the observation, yeah, it looks like the vine is harming the tree. So that's a completely different kind of relationship. That one is one where one partner is harming the other partner. And that type of symbiotic relationship is called parasitism. And there we go. And that's your 2 marks there. Then we look at reasons why the vine causes the leaves of the tree to die. There are 2 ways you can do that. One is you are diverting nutrients and water and minerals away from the leaves towards this vine, because what the vine will do is connect to the tree's vascular bundles and divert the nutrients and water that would have been moving through those vascular bundles. It diverts that into its own body. So the leaves that are upstream of that would be deprived of water, minerals, and other nutrients. So therefore, they get malnourished, they dehydrate, and they may die. Another way that those leaves can be harmed is that the foliage of the orange-yellow vine covers the foliage of the tree, and therefore is depriving the leaves of that tree of sunlight. And of course, leaves need sunlight to photosynthesize and produce glucose, etc. So if they cannot photosynthesize, they are not going to be able to produce glucose, and eventually those leaves would wither away and die, in addition to the lack of nutrients it's getting from the vascular bundles. And then we go to the next part. So this is a natural selection question. And these kinds of questions are popping up more often over the next few years. So it's a topic that it's not as well done in the region so far. So if you are able to handle questions like this well, it ranks you highly for these types of questions. Right? So remember, we collected some lizards. So they noticed that 4 of the lizards are green and 2 of the lizards are brown. And they are now, we checked out, say, okay, they look like, remember 2017, June 2017? Do we use physical appearance to classify them into separate species? No. And we have a perfect example here. So we've seen 4, and we've seen 4 that are green, 2 that are brown, and realize, oh, okay, they look different, but are they separate species? We don't know. So later on, field scientists would do their research and determine that, yes, they are members of the same species. And now you're using the theory of natural selection to explain why you have more green lizards than brown ones. So the green lizards, remember you're talking about the leaves would be green. So the green lizards would be better camouflaged, which means that they'll be harder for the predators to find. And therefore they would survive in greater numbers and produce more offspring like themselves. The brown lizards, on the other hand, they aren't as well hidden against the green foliage. So therefore, more of them are found and eaten by the predators, less numbers to produce more brown offspring like themselves. And therefore, according to the theory of natural selection, so this is where you bring in the jargon, where you basically indicate that, look, the brown lizards were selected against by the natural conditions, and the green lizards were selected for by the natural conditions, and therefore, eventually the green lizards will become the majority of the lizard population over several generations. Then we have question 2, where we're being asked to list the final digestive products of 3 macronutrients. So those are your products here. Carbohydrate, final product is monosaccharide, example glucose, or you can say simple sugars such as glucose, because remember you have several types of simple sugars that would end up being your final digested product. Another example of a simple sugar would be fructose. When you break down sucrose, you get glucose and fructose. So therefore, you really can't give glucose as the final product. It has to be either monosaccharide or a simple sugar. Then protein, that one is a lot more straightforward. Amino acid is your final product. And for fats, glycerol and fatty acids are your final products of digestion. So it's just not one. Don't just say fatty acids. It has to be both, glycerol and fatty acids. Those are the final products. And then we talk about how they get to the liver. So the protein end product, which would be your amino acids, those would diffuse and at later stages via active transport. They will be transferred across the walls of the intestinal villi into nearby blood capillaries, right? And these capillaries will merge into the hepatic portal vein, and that is going to transport these digested products directly to the liver. If you notice for the fats, however, the pathway is a little more convoluted in that it does not go into the blood capillaries from the intestines. It's going to diffuse into a structure called the lacteal, and this lacteal is a part of your lymphatic system. So it's going to travel through the lymphatic system until it gets to the point where the lymphatic system empties into the circulatory system that occurs at the subclavian vein. And from there, it can be transferred to the liver. It goes in lots of other places too, but a good portion of it is transported to the liver. And that's the difference between protein and fats in terms of how they get to the liver. Then we're talking about the pancreas now. So the pancreas, they're highlighting that, yes, they play an important role in the digestion of food, and they're also very important. They contribute to homeostatic control of blood sugar levels. So here we're going to take a look at the role of the pancreas in the digestion of food first. And this is where we talk about the production of pancreatic juice, which is released into the duodenum. So you need to specify where it is released and when. So as the chyme is released from the stomach, so the stomach has done its work on the food. The food is now basically this liquid mixture called chyme, and it's very acidic. So as it leaves the stomach, the pancreatic juice is released onto it. And this pancreatic juice has sodium bicarbonate, which changes the pH of the chyme from pH 2, which is very acidic, to an alkaline pH of around 8. And then the chyme can move on to the rest of the small intestine. Also, that pancreatic juice contains several enzymes such as lipase and trypsin, and these enzymes will just continue the chemical digestion of the nutrients that are present, right? And that's your answer there. So those are your 3 points. 3 points, 3 marks. Then we have a line diagram now that is a summary of the role of the hormones that control blood glucose levels. We have 2 hormones to talk about, and you just have to fill it in by adding the name of the correct hormone. So this box would be connected to this arrow here. And for this box, it's showing us that glucose is converted to glycogen. So insulin would be the hormone responsible for stimulating or influencing that process. And then the other arrow is taking us from glycogen to glucose and is connected to this box. And in this one, we're being shown that glycogen is being broken down to glucose. And the hormone that is responsible for stimulating that process is glucagon. I almost said glycogen. Glucagon, right? And yeah, and that's how they work. Insulin influences storage, whether it's in the form of glycogen, as in this diagram, or even in the fatty cells conversion to fats. And glucagon stimulates the release of glucose, right, by breaking down the glycogen into glucose. So that's the diagram there. Then we have to talk about the role of the liver. So how does the liver, what role does it play? What does it do? Well, the liver definitely responds to these 2 hormones, insulin and glucagon. So in response to insulin, which would be released if the blood sugar level goes above the set point. So you have a set value or set level at which blood glucose should be, and that is called your set point. So if it goes up, the blood sugar levels goes above that set point, then the hormone insulin is released, and the liver responds, well, the cells of the liver responds to this hormone by taking glucose from the blood and restoring it as glycogen. And that would help to decrease the blood sugar concentration back down to set point. Then the blood sugar levels, if they are below set point now you need to find a way to bring that blood sugar level back up. And what happens is that glucagon is released into the bloodstream, it gets to the liver, and the liver cells respond by breaking down the glycogen they have stored to glucose. And that glucose is then released into the bloodstream, and that helps to increase blood sugar concentration. Then for part E now, we're being shown, we have a graph here. Let me just zoom back in to make this a little bigger. Right, a little better. And we have 2 persons, A and B. And they're showing their blood glucose concentration over 48 hours. So let's take a look at what's happening here. As usual, we want to take our time and understand the graph. So on the y-axis, we have blood glucose levels, milligrams per deciliter, all right? And we're going from 0 to all the way to 350. And in the x-axis, the label is time. And we can see it's marked actual time being marked off. And the title for the entire graph is Variation in Blood Glucose Concentration over 48 hours. All right. As you can see, there's also the unbroken line is represented, that represents person A, and the broken line represents person B. Then we have this square represents food. So we can assume that at these points where we see this square, the person has ingested some food, right? They've eaten some food and their bodies are breaking it down and so on. And we notice there's a big difference between A and B. A, you have these huge spikes of blood glucose levels, right? The amount of glucose in the blood gets really high after eating some food. And notice it takes a long time to drop back down to previous levels, right? And person B now, we don't see these huge spikes. The highest spike we've seen is around here. That could be like 125 or so. And this one is a little higher. Yeah, it's about a 125, the highest level. The lowest is about 75, right? And it doesn't get much higher than that, which is a sign that this person is managing their blood glucose levels really well. So we can definitely say that A is diabetic. And this person is normal, at least with respect to diabetic conditions, they are non-diabetic. All right, non-diabetic. Okay, so let's look at the question. And as we can see, we already answered the question, which person is most likely suffering from diabetes mellitus? And we know that's person A, but we have to give a reason. So we indicate that there are two directions you can go. You can say that there are sharp increases in blood sugar concentration with food intake, as shown in the graph. And we can also say that blood sugar concentration gets to very high levels for long periods, as we can see here, right? The highest for the normal person is 125. But for the majority of the time, for person A, the blood glucose levels are much higher than 125. It tends to be above, far above 125 on a regular basis. So that tells us that, okay, this person is diabetic. And you do indicate that it's because of the lack of insulin or lack of response to insulin that the excess sugar is not being removed effectively. And this causes these sharp increases. Or the blood sugar levels just staying at a high level for long periods of time. Right? And based on the data range for a healthy person, well, as we saw there, 75 to about 120, or we could say 75 to 125. They usually give you an error range that's acceptable, plus or minus 5. So once you're within that error range, you would be all right. Okay. AA. Then we have question 3. We are provided with a diagram showing us an enlarged section of a human lung. And it's a section of the lung, so we can definitely say that it's the part of the lung showing the alveoli and the bronchioles feeding into the alveoli, as well as some blood vessels, right? It's also showing us blood supply. So we could, label the parts as stated. So we know this is the bronchiole for sure, right? And these are the alveoli. And then we have here the capillaries around the alveoli. So that's called your capillary network or your alveolar capillary network. And then we have this blood vessel feeding into that capillary network. And since this is the direction of blood flow towards the alveoli, that means it's an arteriole. I place artery here, but arteriole is the better answer, right? Then we name, and as the question asks, name the structures labeled. Well, we did it already, so we just have to name them. 1 is that, 2 is that, etc. And then for part 2, we have to talk about the function of the parts, but not all, just parts 2 and 4. So 2, which would be your pulmonary arteriole, and 4, which is your capillary network. So part 2, that's the transporting the oxygenated blood from the body to the alveoli. And 4 is facilitating diffusion of oxygen to the blood and carbon dioxide out of the blood. All right, which is essentially your gaseous exchange that's happening at this point. Then we have how cigarette smoking and all the chemicals that can destroy the lung tissue. And they're now asking us to talk about how the lungs would appear. So notice appearance, not how it feels, not the texture, right? How it looks. So the lungs of a smoker would be blackened due to tar deposits as compared to the pink lungs of a non-smoker. And also you'll find in a smoker that there may be holes present due to broken down alveoli, right? Whereas with the non-smoker, you would have a very smooth surface, yeah? Then we have benefits of placing a band. So it's a suggestion. So any appropriate suggestion that makes sense, that's, reasonable, that's relevant, you will get the mark for it. There's no set, number of answers that you have to meet, right? They may have suggested answers like what I have here, but if you come up with other answers that are reasonable, they would, you would get the mark for it. So we have here 1, it makes smoking in public less convenient. Yeah, so that's, when people have to smoke, they have to get up, they have to go outside, go under this awning or whatever, and smoke, right? So that makes smoking less of a convenient activity. It makes it more uncomfortable. So that helps to encourage smokers to stop. And the other, a very important benefit is that it reduces exposure to secondhand smoke. So if I'm a non-smoker, I don't have to deal with this secondhand smoke coming at me, which they've shown to be, if not as dangerous, almost as dangerous as you smoking the cigarette yourself. So not allowing smoking in public places, that helps to reduce exposure of non-smokers. So they don't have to deal with that. And then 2, reduces the exposure of young people to seeing people smoke. And it makes it less attractive, right? The difference between seeing somebody, rocking back in their sofa or their office chair and smoking versus, huddling under an awning outside the building to smoke. It makes it less attractive. It's not as attractive because they have seen that for many young people, like teens and so on, for a lot of them, they started smoking because they saw somebody they admired or they found cool smoking. So if you can remove that coolness factor or reduce the coolness factor, less young people will smoke. Right? And it does seem to have an impact. Of course, now we have vaping, which just takes us to a whole other level. So I don't know, that one, it's still very much a problem amongst young people. But now it's not so much cigarettes, but now it's vaping and e-cigarettes. Then we have the addictive component in cigarettes, suggests 1 negative impact of drug addiction, right? We have the addictive component is nicotine, and any one of these can be listed as a negative impact. Of course, this is just touching the surface. And I do have a blog where I provide notes on topics like this in detail. And this is one of those areas that I definitely put some energy and time into. So you can always check out my blog for those notes. The link will be in the bio below. Then we have, right, we have comparing the, well, we're talking about functions that are similar. We have a similar function between alveolus and a dicot leaf. And we're being asked to show 3 ways in which they are adapted to carry out this similar function. And the similar function is gaseous exchange. Yeah. So basically we are highlighting, or we are describing the characteristics of a gaseous exchange surface. Yeah. So I added 3 here. But again, you can check the notes in my blog for a little more detail, giving some more characteristics. Officially, it's about 5. And you can, look at those characteristics. But these are the 3 that are the most relevant to this particular question. Yeah. And that's it for questions 1 to 3. So be on the lookout for the next video that lists, that goes through questions 4 to 6.